Thank you very much. So I'm here to take the opposite opinion, and obviously we should not be admitting all elderly patients to our ICU. So if we look through the literature and see how people decide to admit patients or refuse patients, you can see there are a long list of things, and certainly age is one of those that's listed. But when we did a survey of Society of Critical Care Medicine healthcare professionals several years ago, they felt there are more important reasons why we should admit or refuse a patient. Quality of life as viewed by the patient, probability of surviving. And when we asked them, should patient's age be a reason for excluding a patient, the large majority said no. But sometimes, as you know, what physicians say and what they do are not necessarily the same thing. So if you look through the literature and you look to see, is age an independent risk factor for mortality, it turns out that it depends on the paper that you're looking at. And some find age to be an independent factor, and some find that it's related to the comorbidities that are causing the mortality. So since he's not that old. But in any event, I will stress those studies which show that age is an independent factor for mortality. Looking at some oncological patients, we find that age was independently associated with increased mortality. Looking at patients age 70 years were studied, and if you look at those patients over 70, the mortality was 19%, and 47% died within a year. In those less than 85, it was 56% and 27%. And again, logistic regression showed that age, diagnostic, and severity of illness were independent predictors for one-year survivals. A much larger study in elderly patients more than 65 found that many of the elderly patients were more likely to have comorbid conditions. So many of the physicians refusing these patients don't talk about the age, they talk about the comorbidities, but certainly the age is one of the reasons why people refuse patients. And case fatality rates increased linearly by age, and again, an independent factor for mortality. Another study, more than 65 years versus less than 65 years, you can see that the mortality of the elderly was higher, not that high, and we certainly admit patients with higher mortalities. But again, it was a problem with higher mortalities in the elderly, and when you look at quality-adjusted life years, obviously this increased with age too. And when you look through the literature and look at the large studies of triage and the factors important for refusing patients, you can see that most of the studies have older age being the reason why people refuse. So it's nice for us to say we wouldn't use age to refuse patients, but when you objectively look at it, we in fact are doing it. So here's a paper from my colleague who just presented, and you can see that even he and his collaborators, and I think most of us also, say that we should look at age, and there are some patients who should be admitted, and also there are some patients who should not be admitted. So let me give you some information that we have from a large prospective multi-center study looking at triage. But I think when we look at the natural term of life, those at the end of their life have a duty to forego expensive technology treatments in the interest of younger people. The old have already enjoyed more community support from the young, and the individual with a fixed allocation of lifetime health care would use those in their earlier years rather than their older years. For the distribution of healthcare resources to be fair, it should consider the consequences for the whole lives of the affected persons and not just how badly off they are at this present time. And since a person is worse off if he dies young than if he dies old, it's fair to give the scarce resources to the young rather than to the old. Now, healthcare is a limited resource, and it would be good to allocate this to achieving the greatest good for the greatest numbers. and the lives having equal value, we could affect this probably more so by taking care of the young. And we might even have an economic argument. It's the interest of the old people of the future to spend more keeping the young and the working alive so they can help support them during their retirement. So I'm not arguing that we should not provide care to the elderly. We should provide care, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in intensive care. And interestingly, in our country, half of the patients who are on ventilators and half the patients who meet criteria for being in intensive care are cared for on wards and not intensive cares. That's probably very unusual and probably not occurring in other countries, but we have a great lack of intensive care beds. So all lives are of equal value. Society awards the same medal for saving an old lady and a young woman. We are not assessing the moral value of acts. We are trying to distribute limited resources fairly. And when forced to choose, we would and probably the most important way to decide what we should be doing is if you ask an old person which patient with respiratory failure should be admitted to the last ICU bed, themselves, the 75-year-old patient or the 25-year-old patient, most elderly people would say, give it to the young person. I've had a good life. Give it to the young person. So in conclusion, age is an independent risk factor for mortality. If the limited available medical care is to be used most effectively, age certainly must be taken into consideration. Age is, in fact, being used for triage decisions around the world on a daily basis, be it biased or not. And age is an ethical, objective, and cost-effective criteria for rationing health care and ICU care, so that I hope I have convinced you the evidence is clear. Age should and must be a factor for triage decisions in the ICU. Thank you very much.